Afternoon. Is it Lauren? You there?
Hi, Avi. Yes, I'm here.
Hi there. And is it Simon? Are you there?
Yes, good afternoon, colleagues.
Hi, Simon.
How is everyone?
Okay.
Well, thank you. And yourselves?
Good, thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay, so we're just waiting for the panelists. Okay.
And we have about a minute ahead to go before our scheduled start.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Have we got a YouTube link yet?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Dr. Charrington, that is 5 o'clock on the dot.
Thanks, Simon. I'm not seeing the panelists though, are you? No? Let me see if they're in the participant list.
I think one of our panelists has joined. Unfortunately, I see they've got the incorrect name. I'll work to correct that.
Okay. Hi, Hannah. I see you saying some people are battling to get through the link. I'm not sure why.
Dr. Charrington, I can share that we did have some number of students in the recurring B.Ed Honours meeting awaiting the start of this. I think they used the wrong link to join.
Okay.
I have ended that session, so those students should be directed to join this webinar.
Hey, good afternoon, students. I believe some were in the wrong space, but welcome. You are in the right place if you're seeing me. Welcome to the webinar. We are just waiting for our two guest speakers to join us, and we'll be starting shortly. So feel free to engage in the chat forum so long, say hello, catch up, and we will resume shortly. Right, welcome. Dr. Molefe, I see you have joined us. Welcome. Let's see if we can hear you loud and clear. And Dr. Akala, I see you are there as well. If you wouldn't mind putting on your cameras and your mics just so that we can see if all the text is going. Welcome.
Thanks. Good afternoon. And
Good
thanks for
afternoon.
welcoming us into this beautiful platform.
Wonderful to have you here.
Can you hear me clear, loud, and am I clear?
You're clear to me. Simon and Lauren, is it clear for you guys?
Yes, sounds good.
Yes, fine, Avi.
Perfect. And Beatrice, I'm seeing you're with us. I don't know if your camera and microphone are working.
Hi, I don't know why my photo is not being seen, but I've put video on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Not a problem. We've got our IT people looking into it, so hopefully we can get the video going, but we can certainly hear you loud and clear. So welcome to our speakers. And welcome to the students. I'm just going to just get the ball rolling in the meanwhile, and Simon, just let us know if there's anything we can do to fix Dr. Akala's video.
Dr. Charrington, thank you. If I can just have a moment. Dr. Akala, I see your video is working correctly, but it seems there may be a cover or some covering of the webcam on your laptop or on your PC. If you do have a slider on your webcam, could you just make sure that it's slid open? I'm hoping that is the issue.
It is open. I don't know what's happening from my end.
Okay, at the very least, we can hear you. So if you would like to turn off your video, that will at least save you some bandwidth.
Okay.
Otherwise, Beatrice, we can wait for you a few minutes if you want to log off and try again.
Yes, I can do that. Yeah, let me do that.
Make sure you link on the email that was sent to you as your personal invite, not the one I sent you.
Okay.
Okay. Let's try and see if that works, Simon. It would be nice to see you.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Charrington. That'll be great.
Taryn, you seem to be in a time warp, my dear. We're still on Webinar 2. Webinar 1 was last month, and Webinar 3 will be occurring in May, and we're not in May yet. So this is Webinar 2. Right, so welcome to our students, welcome to staff members. I see there are some present, and welcome to guests while we wait for Dr. Akala to connect again. So I'm Dr. Avi Charrington, and I'm the program coordinator for the B.Ed Honours program. And with me is Lauren, who is also a senior lecturer on the B.Ed Honours program. And we're very excited to present our monthly webinars. And the reason we do these webinars is that our honours program is really about fostering critical thinkers. We believe that education stakeholders should be engaging in critical conversations about what is happening in education. We also believe in the program that knowledge does not only exist in books and academic journals. Knowledge is all around us, and it exists in the conversation and the experiences and the lived realities of people in education. So the key here is that we want your students to really listen to the conversations, listen to how different people with different backgrounds in education and different experiences come into the space talking about the same theme and topic, but from different perspectives. And the idea is that always dialogue and debate and critique is not about pulling down ideas, but it's listening to multiple perspectives and building on your own. And that is really key here in listening to how the different speakers build knowledge and how we converse about this theme of looking at inclusive education from an Afrocentric lens or worldview. Right, so I remind you all as participants, we don't bring you onto the panel, so I can't see you. But there are many ways to engage with us. The first is in the discussion forum. So we look for comments, ideas, if something resonates with you, if you want to just put an idea out there, if you want to engage with your fellow students and participants, and please get chatty on that discussion forum. We do then save it at the end of the session and put it up so you can look back on that. And you'll see that Lauren and I also put some questions there for you as we go along. So keep your eyes on that discussion forum. If you have a question that you would like to address the speakers directly, then if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little Q&A. Please put your question in there and I will be checking throughout the conversation. And those will be the questions I ask the panel. So please don't put your questions in the chat forum because there's often a lot of things happening there and I might miss it. So questions for the panel in the Q&A. And please also address today questions about the webinar. I'm not going to address questions about the program or the module specifically. Those you need to put into the module Canvas pages, not here. Right, so without further ado, just want to say hello to Lauren. You can put your camera on for a minute just so that you know she is a person behind there who helps me. There we go. Hi, Lauren. Thank you. And then to our speakers, I see we've lost Dr. Akala there, but Dr. Motsama Molefe, if I can ask you to introduce yourself. I always think that it's very important for people to introduce and talk a little bit about who they are, because coming from my mouth and my words, it would be very different. So we are very honored to have you here. I attended a presentation on ethics in education where Motsamai was presenting, and it blew me away. I really resonated with how he explained what Afrocentric worldview is about. And so I'm really, really excited to have him here. And I think that the students and our participants are really going to have a wealth of knowledge here. So Motsama, welcome to our webinar. And please tell us a little bit about yourself so the students know who you are, where you are, and what you do.
Thanks a lot. I come from the school of thought where it is inappropriate to introduce yourself, to tell people who you are, what you're about. It's associated, but since I'm foot in the sport, I really do not like it. But thanks a lot. Look, I was born in Soweto. I'm Sotho Zulu. I had the misfortune of training in philosophy. I'm trained. I hold a PhD in philosophy. And yeah, I work in the areas of African philosophy, but mainly I work in ethics, African ethics, ethics in general, African ethics, applied ethics, environmental ethics. I also do some work in political philosophy. I'm currently working for the University of FoE in the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, where I'm a senior researcher. I've published the concept I focus on in my work is the concept of personhood. The concept of personhood. That's the concept I use to imagine the world. I use that concept to imagine the world. Maybe in our discussions, some of my imaginations, I could share some of the imaginations there. Yes, I've published Yeah, I'm a chief editor for 2 journals. The first journal is Journal for Inclusive Public Policy. I've recently been appointed as a chief editor of the South African Journal of Philosophy. I've authored 5 monographs and 1 anthology. My latest book is on human dignity in African philosophy, a very short introduction. So my direction is moving more in thinking about human dignity. But at the heart of that is just the concept of personhood. So yeah, so very roughly, that's what about.
Super, thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Beatrice, how are you managing with your video? Are we just going to hear you today?
I'm trying. I'm asking my son to assist. So before we succeed, I can just speak. Then you'll be able to see my face at some point. If that is okay with you.
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, so Dr. Carla Beatrice. My research is mainly in gender and higher education. Originally from Kenya. I work within the social justice field. Currently a research associate at the University of Johannesburg, and I also teach curriculum studies and in education studies at the University of the Witwatersrand. So in the 2 universities, I'm currently working. I do a lot of gender writings in terms of journal articles that I've authored. I have book chapters. I'm also a peer reviewer of several journals. I also write for the Conversation Africa. I have a few articles with them. And currently I'm working on a UNESCO project that is looking at right to higher education. I've also been invited as a keynote speaker to talk about curriculum change in Kenya, because Kenya is currently going through curriculum change, looking at CBC, competence-based education. So I authored an article that caught the eye of the education department in Kenya, and I was invited to go and share my views on what I think, the current education landscape is like in Kenya. So generally, you'll find most of my writings, my engagements in the area of gender. But I'm also a multidisciplinary scholar, and that is why I come in with rurality. Also, I look at rurality and transitioning to higher education. I also deal with issues to do with decolonization in higher education. I've written an article on that. Also, I'm interested in curriculum studies. I have also taught at University of Pretoria, that is in leadership and management, a program for school heads that is coming in for a diploma in school leadership and management. So I was part of that course, and currently I am an external examiner at the University of Pretoria. So in a nutshell, that is Dr. Carla.
In a nutshell, that's very impressive. Okay, so I can see the students are going, wow, there. Right, so this is going to be a conversation, and this is the idea with scholarship, is that everybody has valid opinions and ideas, and we're here to learn from one another. So Beatrice, while we have you, let's start there with what is your understanding, of Afrocentric worldview or philosophy? What does it mean to you, and how do you explain such a concept in non-academic theoretical terms?
Oh, yes. So such a huge phrase to be thinking about, especially now that we are talking about decolonizing the curriculum in South Africa. And when you talk about Afrocentric view, I think one thing that comes to mind is African. So Afrocentric worldview would rotate around, the African way of knowing our cultures and the way we think, or the African people think about, various issues that affect the continent at large. And I'm saying is huge because we have different scholars and authors who look at the Afrocentric view from different perspectives, and not just to think about Africa alone, because we have a huge African community in diaspora that is also looking at Afrocentric worldview. So thinking about centering Africa or African worldview in the way we think about knowledge, in the way we think about our spirituality, in the way that we think about, being a collective way of looking at things. So I would say, that would be how I look at it. But if we have other views, they're also welcome, because we are looking at different perspectives of understanding Afrocentrism. And just looking at the journey, you look at, colonialism and the conquests, you look at slavery and how it affected the African people, you look at Christianity and how it destabilized the way the African worldview has been interpreted and perceived internationally. And hence, we have the debate about bringing the African worldview into whatever that we are doing currently. So I would leave it at that point. Maybe if there's a question, a follow-up question, I would answer.
Sure. And I think, Beatrice, what you're saying is it's so relevant in terms of how we think. And I like how you used the term Afrocentrism, to kind of show a more collective way of being and thinking. And I also like that you've introduced the ideas of diversity, because I think we often think of worldviews and philosophies and paradigms as very siloed, rather than being dynamic, and overlapping. And I have found in my learnings about Afrocentrism is the fluidity and the openness in terms of diversity and therefore inclusion. So is that kind of your, do those two terms correlate with how you see Afrocentrism?
Yes, they do to a large extent, because again, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, then we are asking, what is diversity? And is that kind of diversity, does it encapsulate Afrocentrism? If you look at, if we zone into the African continent, maybe we would see that we have different nationalities, language groups, religions, and all that. So would that be diversity and inclusion? Who gets to be included, and why do they need to be included? When you look at diversity and inclusion, are we thinking about one and the same thing, or are they different things? So again, just on diversity, we've had other arguments about, who is African, Afrocentrism, who is African, who can claim, the place of an African person. And, if you reflect on the former president, Thabo Mbeki is an African. That is a good conversation to be having. So who is an African? Because again, when we start, demarcating the area, we might find that we are not actually being very inclusive, because some people have said being African is, being born on the continent, and you have the huge African communities that is in diaspora that claim the Afrocentrism. So who is this person who is African, and how do we appropriate their views? And, some would say skin color would really matter when you're talking about Afrocentrism. And you have other debates about, if you have been on the continent for such a long time, don't you have a claim to being an African person? So it's a huge discussion.
Absolutely. What an interesting question. Who is African? What is it to be African? And I guess this is the cue here, Motsamai, because here we have a philosopher coming into our conversation. Who is African? what is it to be African? And I guess, you know, in terms of Afrocentric worldview, what does that mean to you?
Well, I'm sorry. You're starting me at a very, it's a difficult
I seem
question.
to be throwing you in the deep end today. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, look, I thought we were going to start by the shallow part end of the waters, but I see we're starting right at the deep end. So this question is, this is at least three ways to think about, just to frames to think about this question. So you could think about this question as a methodological question. When you start your research, you want to frame the category Africa. And in that framing, you want to give content to what you mean by Africa in your own research. In that way, the concept Africa can become methodological. And in that sense, when you use the concept African, you use it in a way that is ordinary. You're using it in a way that is ordinary. Like when you say democracy is Western, you're not saying that every society in the West is democratic, but you're saying this particular disposition, political disposition or polity, is associated largely with this particular geography. So in that sense, the notion of African could mean just that. You could be looking at tendencies or practices or rituals that over a long stretch of time, you associate with a particular place called geography. In that sense, it's very controversial, but so the notion African can be methodological in that sense. It's a concept that you could use to scope the geographical context and the specific cultures within which your conversation is going to proceed, right? So it could just be that. So that's a productive way to use the notion African, right? In contradistinction to that, you could be using the notion of Africa when you use it methodologically and in a positive sense. It's in contradistinction to when you use the notion of Africa in a way that is pejorative, where you associate it with traditionalism, where very problematic way of using Africa, where you treat Africa as if when you say something is African, it's obvious, and that everyone subscribes to it, and that there is homogeneity around this particular category, right? And that everyone in Africa so happens to believe or to accept that thing. In that way, you simplify, you overgeneralize, and in the way you end up misrepresenting things. So that's another way to use the concept Africa, which is very problematic, very problematic. So often when I use it, the notion Africa, it's just to think about the scope in terms of geography and the scope in terms of the frame within which my conversation is going to emerge, as opposed to homogenizing, simplifying what is itself already complicated, the category Africa. So when I'm thinking, so usually when I deal with the concept Africa, my focus is African concepts, and those particular concepts that have stood the test of time. And one such concept, it's the concept of Ubuntu, right? It's a concept that I use. It has stood the test of time, and many other concepts and cultural practices that have stood the test of time. And you say, look, and what is common, what is interesting about concepts that are similar to the ones that I work with is that you find that it manifests itself in different shades and nuances, but there are those commonalities. And then in my work, I try to make sense, systematize them, and make it to have a modern implication. Right? So instead of asking of who is African, I think more of what is African in terms of ideas, so that we're able to frame a world that is meaningful and that is progressive. So that is just one part about it. But the question of who is African, it's a difficult question. And I want to just maybe to throw two cents on that concept about who is African. And maybe one way to think about that question is that it's easy to then take the category of culture. It's a controversial category to think about, to define. In social sciences, the concept of culture is called an essentially contested concept. It's a concept over which there is no agreement about its core defining features. So concept of culture, it's an essentially contested concept. But when you think of culture simplistically, you think as a way of life, and that's a very broad way, but just to make sense of a way of life. So if you think about a way of life, there are two ways to think about a way of life. You could think about a way of life in things that everyone in the world shares in common. And you can think about a way of life in terms of things that you share in common with certain groups. Those two levels. So the things that we share in common with everyone, one perfect example of that is an example.
Have I frozen or has Dr. Molefe frozen?
Yes, Dr. Molefe has. Avi, I think maybe Beatrice can add in and then we can wait for him to come back. I think, yeah, he's lost bandwidth.
I never know if I'm going through some time warp and if it's just me. Or...
No.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so while we wait for the university shutting me up, while we wait for Motsama Beatrice, I think, gosh, I'm so excited with what Motsama was saying. I love that concept of, instead of asking who is African, we start the conversation with what is African. And I think that's so important when we start moving into education. Education is a way of life as well, or it should be. What is the purpose of education? And if we're looking at education to create future citizens of our society, when we start the conversation of what kind of education system do we want in this country, and what would a South African education system look like, which now goes into your space of expertise of decolonization and transformation as well. I think that shifts the conversation so beautifully. Instead of, who is African and who should be benefiting from a South African education system, we talk about what is an African education system and what would it look like in this country.
Yes, so that is a very important conversation when we begin to think about what kind of education for the South African environment and whom are we educating? Because not just about the education system, we have the main beneficiary of the education system. And then we need to think about, what is the end product? Is the current education system meeting the needs of the South African environment? So that conversation does not come alone. It comes with so many other, things to think about critically, because if we are educating for, an African child in this current environment, the 21st century, what kind of education does this child or learner or student need to have access to? And because you're not just educating for South Africa, we are educating our learners and students for the global world. So we need again to think about how competitive will this learner be, will this student be once they leave our shores, those that will end up outside our boundaries. So the conversation is quite long and quite in depth. But currently, when we think about decolonization, and it's a conversation that is ongoing, we are thinking about looking at where we have come from, our history, and how well are our students prepared? How much of the past history is still constricting, the child, the student in our education system? So we try to find out those areas and try to think around how best we can have an African education that will be able to cater for everybody. So in the decolonization space, there are several debates to be able to say, when we think about decolonizing the system, we look at the content. What kind of content are our learners being exposed to? And looking at that content, does it even reflect their lived experiences? Or is it something that has been imposed on them? How much of their lived realities that is reflected in what they are learning now? Are they, need to be looked at so that we are able to say that this is truly an education system that is reflective of a South African or an African environment. So different debates there that we need to have to bring in indigenous knowledges. And coming from an area of disadvantage where we find that indigenous knowledges have been on the periphery. The way that the African people knew appropriated knowledge hasn't come to the mainstream. And hence we are saying, but did we know anything? Was there a way that our people were able to engage the kind of medicines they used? Is that something that we can also bring to the mainstream and be able to interrogate and see if there are any ways that you can be able to even include in the current, degree programs that we are teaching in our schools? So that is a huge debate. But at the same time, we get to find some other, dark spots where we are saying, but who is teaching these, the African knowledges? Are you from the continent? Can you be able to teach Ubuntu? Can you be able to even, talk about African philosophy when you are not of the continent? So again, various schools of thoughts to be able to say this should be an area that should be occupied by people who actually who have lived Ubuntu and who know what Ubuntu is, rather than somebody else from a different, continent coming to claim what is African. So, and I'm saying very critical, contested ideas that are, in the public domain about what kind of education, decolonization. And just to throw something in there, coming from the Kenyan environment. So we had these debates long time ago in the 80s. Kenya got its independence in 1963, and you had a group of scholars, for example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I think the students might have read about decolonizing the mind. And that conversation happened in the 80s, where, the Kenyan people wanted, went through decolonization and looking at the education system and saying what could be wrong about our education system. And just quickly, some of the things that the debates that happened about even the literature that was being taught at the universities. We find that that literature was not, didn't have, the African kids could not identify with the literature books that they were being taught or they are being used in schools. And therefore, there was a whole move to bring in literature by African writers so that the kids could also identify with the environment and looking at, the kind of history that was being taught. the history curriculum had to be changed because we had some, content, for example, that would say the first person to see Lake Victoria, the first person to see Mount Kenya. And we said, hang on, but we've always had, Black people living off the lake, fishing, and their livelihoods are around Lake Victoria. How come they never saw the lake? And we have people around Mount Kenya who pray on the mountain. Their gods are on the mountains. How come they never saw Mount Kenya? So that was the kind of interrogation that we had at that point, therefore leading to a whole change of what our children were learning, to be able to say the first white man to see Lake Victoria, the first white man to see Mount Kenya, and not the first person to see the mountain, the first person to see the lake. So that was the Kenyan environment. I remember we had a book that was used for religious studies. And the title of the book was, God Speaks to Men. And people said, no, God speaks to women as well. So it's not just about God speaks to men, God also speaks to women. So the title of the book had to change to be God Speaks to People, which was all inclusive. So those are just a few of the, ideas that I find now South African education is also looking into, to be able to say, can we then look at the history, look at the geography, and look at the content that we are exposing the learners and the students to make sure that we are not, sidelining, the African ways of knowing, the African environment, our spirituality in the textbooks that are being used in the education sector. I don't know. I think let me stop here and maybe wait for a question or so.
You have covered so much here, and I can see the chat conversation here going mad, and I'm so glad to see the students really engaging with these ideas. And you're absolutely right. I'm glad that I think we need spaces for critical and contested issues to be discussed, because to me, that is what higher education is about. We shouldn't shy away from these conversations. And I see, Lauren, you want to ask something. So I just want to welcome quickly Mutsamai back. As we were busy talking about what would an education system from an Afrocentric lens look like. So if we're talking about, like you said, not who is African, but what is African, then the question was then, what is an African education? And what might it look like to have an education system in this country based on what is African? So while you're thinking on that, because I always seem to give you the difficult questions, I'll let Lauren just add in a little bit. Yes, Lauren.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Beatrice, I just wanted to ask you maybe if you could just explain, because our students haven't had much background on like Ngugi and Fanon, and that's too, cumbersome to get into today. But just maybe if you can just give them a little example of, like, when we talk about decolonization, just the distinction between epistemic decolonization and geographical, because I think that will definitely just link into what both of you have said in terms of the diaspora, the notion of being an African, what is African? I think that might just, connect the dots as such.
Thank you, Lauren. Beatrice, do you want to give that a go?
Okay, yes. So thank you, Lauren. When we talk about geographical decolonization, especially on the African continent, you'll notice that we talk about Anglophone, we talk about Francophone, and we talk about Lutophone. So meaning that the kind of disconnect on the continent can be attributed to the past colonial, demarcation, where we would clearly say we are Anglophones because we are connected to the British, colonial masters on the continent. Then you'd have the Francophone connected to French or France, and then you have the Portuguese with the Lutophone. So those are, kinds of demarcation that we are currently struggling with, where we identify ourselves, geographically, depending on who colonized us. And I think if the students are very keen and following the debates, especially the language debate on the continent, you'll find that, you know, if somebody has read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, you'd find that Ngugi revolted the use of English language, especially in the Kenyan environment, because of the kind of, you know, marginalization that happened that was also based on ethnicity. So where you are based and the kind of, you know, pronunciations that come with your ethnicity that created a lot of, you know, silent spaces in classrooms whereby a child who does not pronounce an English word properly is kind of ridiculed by their peers. So that really made Ngugi to say, you know, the African languages have power in their own, and therefore he decided to start writing in his mother tongue, which is Gikuyu, and also wrote in Swahili. So the politics of language is quite a big topic, and Ngugi has done a bit of justice on it. You know, so that would be your geographical kind of decolonization, and you can see that we are talking about bringing in, you know, our African languages, appreciating them, using them for, you know, as medium of you know, learning. And recently, the African Union has adopted Swahili, which is an African language, you know, to be used in their own, you know, businesses. So again, saying we shouldn't, you know, sideline African languages, because that is, you know, moving away from, you know, being African. When we talk about epistemic decolonization, so that is epistemology, that is knowledge, how we get to know, what kind of knowledge is centered, what occupies the center and what occupies the periphery. And that is why then we talk about Afrocentric and we talk about Eurocentric. For a long time, on the African continent, even in South Africa, we find that the knowledge, the ways of knowing that has been at the center has mainly been, you know, Eurocentric. So when we talk about then dealing with epistemic decolonization, we are also thinking about Afrocentrism. How do we then center? In fact, if you read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, it's about centering Africa, you know, the way we know, and then we can look at, you know, other ways of knowing in conjunction with the African way of knowing. I don't know if I've answered your question, Maureen.
Yes, thanks, Beatrice. I think it just gives the students a bit of a perspective, you know, in terms of seeing that it is so vast and it is so huge, and it's a field that, you know, there's so much writing on it, but I think it will just center the students around thinking about the Afrocentrism, etc. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Motsamai, back to you. I think a lot of food for thought for you to give some of your perspective on.
Look, I think I've lost context, specifically because I was still explaining something else when I got lost.
No problem.
When I got lost. So when I think of an African-based education, in the first instance, I think it's just recognition of the geography we inhabit, that we imagine ourselves in this place called Africa, and our imagination in thinking about knowledge starts from that fact. And why this is important, I'm going to give an example for this. Often when we imagine education in Africa, we don't imagine education in Africa. We imagine how we can replicate, reproduce, or meet certain Western or other standards. So immediately, we are not imagining education as people in Africa, for Africa. We imagine education already with assumptions that there are other geographical locations that should set a standard for us of what we should aim for. So one of the things that used to frustrate me when I was still a student at Wits University is that the university I'm sorry for mentioning the university, but it positions itself, as a premier university in Africa, but it wants to be, it's running the race that is run by Ivy League universities. It wants those standards to define who they are, right? And I really felt uncomfortable about that because I felt that we're going to miss a lot of opportunities to really reinvent the wheel, to reimagine the world, to reimagine how we can reframe the world, right? So for me, imagine yourself and operate and recognize where you are, the geography itself, right? That's the first component. But the second component is that places are not empty. Places are not empty. When colonizers came into places that they colonized, one of the fundamental errors they made was to assume that places they occupied, they treated them as spaces as if they were empty. So there was that derecognition, there was that erasure that happened. And because of that erasure, then colonization happened by them replacing what they raised with what they thought was legitimate, which were frames from other places. So the second thing is recognizing that Africa is a place, and Africa has got concrete things that occupy it. And those could be a variety of ideas. So that could be forms and systems of knowledge, what people call indigenous knowledge systems. Those could be languages. Those could be ideas about architecture. Now, when Mapungubwe was discovered that there were kingdoms that were mining in Africa. So mining was not discovered in Kimberley. Mapungubwe was evidence that there was mining in Africa. There was mining just here in South Africa, in South Africa, right? So there was sophisticated architecture when you look at the walls of the Great Kingdom that was in Zimbabwe across Venda. So places were occupied. There were knowledge systems, and there were so recognize that. But when you recognize that, you're not recognizing it as a historical fact. You're recognizing it with something which is very crucial. The idea that all these historical facts tells us something about human life in Africa, that there were agents who created these things. But the most important thing about when we discuss decolonization is not just recovering Africa as in going back to history, but is recovering the kind of humanity that can create and recreate new forms of being Africa. And that for me, I think, has been what has been missing. When you say people are African, and you say, but you want to go back to Africa, I say, where exactly? To the 10th century, to the 7th century. And I think the conversation is misplaced because there have been many ways throughout the history of Africa of being African, because these were agents who were imagining and recreating worlds. The kingdoms we're talking about that were in Africa are no longer there. And the real question is, could we have an education system that recognizes human beings for being human and ignites them as agents so that they can frame an Africa that is accommodating, that is robust for human life to be possible? If that's what African education is, that's what it is for me. And for me, why that is so, because at the heart of an education system is creating conditions for human beings to be able to manage and to create the world that is suitable for human habitation. And that's what education is for me. And the minute we start a conversation at that level, then when we talk about decolonization, then we're able to contextualize that. Excuse me, when we talk about the exclusion of women, we're able to contextualize that. We want them to be agents that can function in the world. When we talk about violence in Africa, we want to think about what are the conditions that create this violence? Right? Why is there so much violence? When we want to deal with question of the economy, and a lot of people, this one thing I've always said to people, that when people talk about decolonization, they think decolonization is just about ideas. I'm saying the economy itself is a cultural infrastructure. Money is an invention of a culture. So even you can talk about meaningful about economic decolonization, how to think about the economy. And one of the things that will shock you that for the longest time, we've thought within the frame and the prisms of capitalism and socialism. But no one has really asked the questions, are there other frames that are outside of the orthodox through which we can reimagine culture? And I think at the heart of it is training agents who will be able to respond to situations in the place called Africa.
I will give you a break there. Wow, there's just so much there that I love the idea that you're talking about creating conditions, that education is about creating conditions for humans to function and be in the world. And that is really so insightful, because I feel that we often lose sight of what is the purpose of education in the first place. We say it serves society, but in what way? And especially that we've become so into this neoliberal commodified sense of education. I think we forget what the purpose of that. And I love that you bring this idea of thinking outside the box, thinking outside of existing frames. You cannot re-envision something in a new way if you're simply doing a patchwork of what already exists and trying to compete with these Ivy League international and saying, how do we do African education, but you're still wanting to fit into existing frames and boxes. And I think that's very important, that things for us to think about. And while you're talking, Motsamai, I keep thinking about the idea of the Sankofa bird, you know, and the proverb about that it's not wrong to go back to find what you have forgotten, you know, and I so often think that when we talk about Afrocentric education and transformation, decolonization, I always know the audience is going to ask questions about, oh, but then are we not going to teach science? Oh, but how are we going to be modern? Almost this assumption that African knowledge and indigenous knowledge lacks a sense of innovation and science is absolutely nonsense, because for those scholars who have looked at education systems, we know that the first education or higher education institutions in the world were actually in Africa. It was in Timbuktu in Egypt. And we know that there are many, you know, documents of knowledge that exists before Pythagoras and before, you know, science as we know it. So I think it's really these misconceptions of what it means. So I'm going to go to
maybe
yes.
If I can quickly jump in, I'm sorry. I feel just quickly, if you don't mind. Look, I think I'm sorry because I think underlying all these misconceptions are, they've got a politics, and the politics between these misconceptions is the continued belief that there are extraordinary human beings that can achieve certain things, and there are under-ordinary human beings that cannot achieve certain things. And that is the underlying misconception. And I think that's why sometimes people, so I think the starting point is that when our education sets off with a premise that says every child in the world, whether Africa or anywhere, they've got the equipment, natural equipment, for them to be able to create any kind of wealth that they want to create. And this is at the level of ability. This is not at the level of opportunity. And anyone, if we depart from that assumption, and I think for me, it's when I look at the achievement from the East, they don't surprise me. They're doing what human beings can do. When I look at what the West was able to achieve from the 15th century to now, they are doing what human beings can do. When I think about the theme of Africa and African education, I think at the heart of it is an education that works with that assumption, the assumption that says all of us ordinary human beings can do what any other human being can do. There's nothing special about being anywhere in the world, right? When we say African, we're just saying, understand that you're operating from this particular context with these particular constraints and opportunities, right? And also maybe another thing related to that, and also related to that, is just the idea that and then we're going to talk more, not so much of African education. Maybe we might want to talk of, there might be many education systems in Africa, because all of us, even here in Africa, there's going to be a diversity of thought, and there are going to be conflicts over how we approach things, because somebody's situated in the west of Africa, somebody's situated in South Africa, in Southern Africa, all of those positionalities in different parts of Africa may require different educational systems to respond to different circumstances. So that means that also we need a plurality of thought, even as we think about what it means to be African, so that we don't box people into. So an education in South Africa will be completely different than education in the equator, because our conditions are different. We have to deal with colonization. We have to deal with apartheid. We have to deal with the inequalities that we are facing. We've got to deal with a large number of children who are growing without their both parents. We have to deal with high unemployment creatively within those constraints. So that's why I'm saying we need to think in terms of that plurality, but the assumption should be every child has got an ability to do something special for themselves in this space. And then the politics is, how do we create that opportunity?
How do we create that opportunity? And I think that's so, I think that really epitomizes inclusion. It's not about looking at how do we accommodate children into a mainstream, or how do we provide, but how do we create these opportunities, knowing that the child has the potential inherently to achieve. So very important concepts there. I'm just looking at the Q&A. So students, if you've got more questions, please post them up here. So for Beatrice and Motsamai, we've got here, Mark is asking about the perspective on globalization and Afrocentric worldview. I think, Mark, that Motsamai did mention and did speak to that a little bit, but perhaps we can touch a little bit on that, because I think Beatrice also spoke in terms of, you know, we tend to assume that if we have an African system, then how are learners going to function outside of the borders of South Africa? And I always find that interesting, because I suppose it's the language issue for me, is where we take it for granted, for example, that English, if our education system was not in English, then the first question is, but what happens to learners when they want to go to another country? But most countries in the world are not English home language speakers. Most of Europe, schools are in their home language. The learners do not learn English. The East, the Orient is not English speaking. So again, it's these assumptions that in order to function in the economic world, one must have English. And I think that's a misconception. And so maybe we can speak to that. And before I let you continue, Motsamai, I see there's also a very interesting question here from Mariam about folktales and wisdoms of African knowledge and how these play a role enhancing reform of education. And I think that's also important, because this brings us to a conversation of what is knowledge. And the education system has become so focused on the documented academic textbooks, that form of knowledge, and overlooks a lot of the oral traditions and the oral forms of knowledge, which I think have so much wealth in terms of not only education and development, but inclusion. So perhaps to the question of globalization.
Thanks a lot on that question of globalization. So much of what we've been calling globalization has not been globalization, has been westernization. It's imagining the world from the perspective of the North. So a meaningful conversation about globalization is a conversation. It's a conversation that says, what is the global order? What's the global order of knowledge? What's the global order of politics? And how do we create conditions for a global order that is truly global? Right? Let me give an example of this, of something that really frustrates me about this. Look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's supposed to be a document that talks about equal rights of every individual. And these rights are administered, by the United Nations. But if you look at the United Nations Security Council, there are people who've got veto rights, there are people who've got permanent seats, and there are countries that have got, there are parts of the world that have got no access to that particular arrangement. Right? It's a global forum, but it's not one that is characterized by what we would meaningfully normatively think as globalizing function. So in terms of education, I'm looking for a situation where our children will have access to textbooks that are produced locally, that are relevant to what they need, and textbooks that are produced in other parts of the world that will empower that education. I went through an education system where all my textbooks came from America, and they were even written, these were for non-American students, societies. Right? I'm looking for a world where, in terms of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, we equalize the infrastructure for participation, for competition, so that all of us can come in as equal players. For example, if you look at the context of presses, people who publish our work, is dominated by the global north, right? The economy and that space, right? So we talk about globalization of knowledge, right? We are far from that, because the infrastructure, the opportunities, and the actual means of production, it's in the global north. So the conversation about globalization really for me is a conversation about justice. How do we create a world where we equalize the platform for participation for all cultural groups, for all countries, for all citizens in the world to be able to contribute to that, so that all cultures can contribute to what we may think of as a globally flourishing human society. But what we see here are interests that dominate the space. So that's one end of the politics of this. But maybe the concern is, how do we teach our young people an education that is locally based, but that is not disconnected? That is not disconnected. Our problem is not an education that is disconnected. Our problem is an education that is over-connected, because all our knowledge is from the global north. So what we should be fighting for is, how do we root ourselves where we are and develop what we have, so that other people anywhere else could have confidence in it. Excuse me. So I think the conversation should be the other way around. We've got enough of what other people have done and what they can do. I mean, the conversation about fourth industrial revolution, we're coming in as consumers. We're coming in as people who are going to be taught. We're going to benefit from what other people have created. And the question has been, how to accelerate ourselves to a level where we can start producers in terms of this thing? And then how do we gear our education to be like that? How do we gear our education to be like that? And that's a difficult conversation, because we're still struggling with literacy. We're still struggling with those basics.
And I think that's so relevant, Motsmai, because what you said there is about, being knowledge consumers. And that is so crucial, because often also in conversations about decolonizing education and looking for an education system that is African for the African continent, I think sometimes we overlook that it's not just about looking inward. It's not just about saying, what works for us as a country, as a continent, as a peoples, but it's also saying, but why can't the world learn from us? There's so many wonderful concepts and notions and knowledge that exists in Indigenous knowledge systems, that exist through an Afrocentric worldview, that could resonate for many other cultures around the world. And how might other countries' education systems benefit if they took a leaf out of our book? Why can't we be knowledge producers that send out theories and models and frameworks and guidelines to improve other countries' education systems, rather than just be consumers of creating something for ourselves?
Thanks, but the assumption of our education is that there's already education in the world. All we have to do is to go get it. We're not coming into education as creators. We don't come into that space, and no one in the world expects us to be creators. We don't even expect ourselves to be creators. Even the standard of who gets a Nobel Prize for best scientific work is already predetermined, right? So for me, it's this basic assumption that we start off with. We don't start by saying we are going to produce some of the leading thinkers in the world who are going to change the direction of paradigms. We don't start our education from there. We start our education from there and say, look, in the global north, there is a standard. And all of us are trying to beat each other in terms of reaching that standard. But we're not starting with an assumption that says we've got a bunch of extremely talented young people here. I'm sorry to use the analogy of extremely talented young people. How do we set them on a course where they'll be global leaders in the future? How do we set them on that course so that they set the trend, they set the standard? And how high do we have to pitch that education? How high do you have to pitch that education? And for me, that's the question that I'm grappling with every day. And I'm grappling with this question not just in terms of education. I sometimes watch soccer and I ask myself a question. How is it that the entire continent of Africa, no team has made it to the quarterfinals? It's the same ball, it's the same clothes, it's the same stadium. What is wrong? And I'm saying there's something wrong about our human condition. There's something wrong about the assumptions we're making about ourselves as we enter into the world. And until we deal with those assumptions, and it doesn't seem to be something simple, radically deal with those assumptions, we're going to be stuck where we are. Let me make a comment about knowledge. So two things there. And this is an insight by Ngugi wa Thiong'o when he is writing an article, Pen and a Tongue. Very obvious observation that the tongue is older than the pen, because the pen is a human invention. A tongue is something that is natural. So any human being that can participate in language can participate in knowledge. But the misconception is that for there to be knowledge, there must be books. No, there are books because human beings already had knowledge, and books are ways of storing that knowledge. So the minute you start understanding that, then books are a tool for archiving human knowledge. Human beings naturally, because they've got the ability, it's a natural ability, you just have to be born and live among human beings, then you can participate in knowledge. So knowledge production is the easiest and the most natural things for human beings. Knowledge is running through. Knowledge is running through as we speak, we share knowledge, all kinds of knowledge. Right? And then we form different communities that can focus on different kinds of knowledge. So in differences, if you look at the traditionals, there will be people who specialize on building houses. There will be people who specialize on how to slaughter a goat. Not everyone has got that knowledge. And there will be people who specialize on hunting. And if you sit among those people, they've got the knowledge about how to do that, right? So for me, it's the assumptions we make about human beings. So we already have got the tools for knowledge production. I hear people talk about indigenous knowledge. I say, no, okay, it's fine, we can talk about indigenous knowledge, but I'm saying, but what do you mean? There are people here who still have the language, who can still share knowledge with us, living active knowledge, right? The problem is that we have set books and peer review systems as standard of what is knowledge, right? And so for me, I'm saying that before we even get to those sophisticated standards, just the human ability to communicate, language, and this is a universal ability, means that human beings, they are participants in knowledge. So epistemically, the error has been that associating the technology of archiving knowledge in books as knowledge. That comes very late. In fact, if you look into human history, writing is much younger than human beings have survived for many thousands of years before writing arrived. But what is new has become a standard of what knowledge is all about. Books are not important, but I'm saying the things that produce the requirement for books are more important. How do we then capacitate other human beings to write even more books, better books, so that we archive more knowledge? Then initial point, believing fundamentally in the human ability and the talents we have. And one of that talent that is universal is talent for language and mind, which produces this knowledge. So for me, it's the ontological assumptions we make about human beings that are crucial, that shape our systems. We work with systems that don't believe that certain human beings can make it. One, we work with systems that believe that you must pay a lot of money for you to get education. And that's why this thing of, then we can have private schools, we can have all of those things, because, and I'm not saying we must overlook the cost of education, but I'm just saying that no matter how much we pay or don't pay, the assumption must be that what is crucial is that you've got the ability to learn. And the minute we get that right, I don't care what system you put in place, human beings can show you what human beings can do. I'm sorry for sounding so optimistic about what human beings can do. But I think the evidence
on fire. You
yeah,
are
so
getting
I think the
applause
evidence,
in the chat forum.
so I think the evidence is all around us that what we need to do is to say young people at Langa, young people at Sentin, to say we believe in all these young people. Let's create opportunities and see what we can make. And the evidence is all around us of what, when I look at a cell phone, when I look at a car, when I look at an aeroplane, I say, it's another one of us has made this. What is the next generation going to make? Then that changes how we think about education. We are thinking of creators. So that's why even when I enter into decolonization, I'm not hungry for us to go back to Africa. I'm hungry for us to create a future that we can say, this is the Africa we want to make, because this is what our world needs.
Wow, thank you. A lot there, and I can see that you are really inspiring the students. And the power has just come on, fabulous, sitting here in the dark. And I can see that the students are really getting very, very inspired with everything you're saying. You're getting wild applause here, and amens and thank you and wows. So much there that Beatrice, I'm scared to bring you in now, because you're going to say a big conversation here to follow. But you've been very quiet, so perhaps to bring you in on some of the key, ideas that have stood up for you from what Motsama was saying in terms of, being our education system and becoming knowledge creators rather than consumers, or anything that kind of stood out for you in the conversation so far.
Thank you. Dr. Msamai has talked about very interesting ideas, and I was actually putting down some of the things that stood out for me. I think when you talked about locally based and not disconnected, so that was very important to be able to say, yes, as we are looking at African people ourselves, whatever we are learning comes from our experiences locally based, but you should not also be disconnected from what is happening out there. I thought that was a very profound point. Then, the idea of creating knowledge, that there's knowledge everywhere and all of us have the ability to be able to create knowledge. You just need the opportunities. I thought that was very important. And I was reflecting on what you said previously about, the early, education can be found on the continent, the areas of Timbuktu. We talk about, Egypt and all that. So we're saying that we are not really, we knew African people knew something, had knowledge, but because of, being misappropriated, then all that was known has been seen as, indigenous knowledge that does not have value, which is a misconception. And just thinking about our own local examples, think about Esther Mahlangu. You can see through her artwork, even with not having formal education, but she's been able to produce masterpieces. That is knowledge that she didn't get from books, but something that she self-taught, and just looking at the environment around her and producing masterpieces that are celebrated worldwide. I think about even the Maasai women, the beaders who make beads, and you can see circumference, you can see radius in what they do. That is high mathematical knowledge. How do they know that, if I make such a bracelet, is going to fit on such an arm? When I make, these beads, these are going to fit around, somebody's neck. So I see that as knowledge that we can be able to appropriate and even, give it credence, because indigenous African knowledge has been here. And we have operated within that parameter. However, when we think about the disconnect between the global north and global south, then we are able to see that the global north has influenced so much of what is written. And Dr. Mlefe says, we have given a lot of attention on what is in the books and not whatever else that exists out of the book. So I think it's a challenge for us and people who are in research to be able to look at other ways of knowing and to be able to write and make that information accessible. I know about the politics of writing and publishing, which ends up disadvantaging some people, and language is a big issue, and where you publish is a big issue, and who you are is a big issue. But it is a moment for us to also think about having our own journals on the continent that can actually be able to publish what it is that we are researching and make it available. When we are thinking about finding African solutions for African problems, how would we be able to find those solutions if we do not actually appreciate what we have? Appreciate that the knowledge that is out there can be used to even help us deal with the climate change disasters like what we are seeing in KwaZulu-Natal currently. So we need to introspect, look within ourselves to be able to find local solutions. Those of you who have an opportunity to read Sefer Day, he talks about an African education that can be able to tackle African solutions. We know that whoever pays the piper gets to dictate the tune, and that is the trouble we have with research. So most of the research that is funded from outside, there is always an agenda that that has to be met. But we are saying we can be able to do our research without conforming to particular frameworks that would be able to please whoever is paying the piper, but come up with solutions that will be able to be utilized locally to deal with African problems.
Lovely, thank you. And I think it just kind of puts everything in a nutshell so beautifully. Thank you for kind of pulling all those threads and really kind of synthesizing the conversations that we've had. So Lauren, perhaps you want to have a few words. Yes, I see your hand. We're thinking about the same thing, but Motsamai, when you said, I love this, the tongue is older than the pen, and talking about as long as you can have a conversation, as long as you have language, you have knowledge. And I think Lauren and I have worked together to design this program over many years. And that was, we had hours of conversation, and we wished we had recorded it. But that was our key thinking. And I wish then I had known this beautiful saying. I think this is going to be my future motto, because that is exactly our feeling, was always about the knowledge. As long as you can have conversation and dialogue, then you can think and you can have knowledge. And so I thought, Lauren, that you would be wanting to have a few words here as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to say too much, but I just love the way Michaela made the link. In our live session last week, we looked at at critical diverse literacy, which links exactly to what our panelists have spoken about today in terms of knowledge, in terms of looking at it's not only book knowledge. We have to read the world. So I'm so happy you've made that connection, because you're seeing that there is a link. And then one other thing I just wanted to mention also that I think is so important, even in the field of inclusive education, and that's where we're locating our B.Ed honors, there is this continual disjuncture and fight amongst academics in terms of the global north and the global south, and it's big. And what has happened is, and this is where I think our South African scholars in inclusion have not put enough in, and hopefully the newer researchers out there that are doing inclusion now and getting into the field and doing PhDs are going to talk about this. We don't have enough. We keep taking the notion of the global north and trying to retrofit it into our situation, our context. And inclusion is context specific, and it doesn't always fit, just like you spoke about now in terms of you know, the African education, etc. So I think this is something we have to start thinking about. We have to start building a scholarship that looks at the scholarship of the South and how the South works with the knowledge that they have, be it the book knowledge, be it the knowledge from the community. And that's how we can build a much better research base, because it's true, we keep subsuming all the ideas from what Ainscough says and what Slee says and so on. And I think we have to start reading the Safavids and the Gosfugels and all those philosophers as well that have looked at work, not only the Fanons, etc. of the world. And we need to look at that and say, now let's look at the South African researchers that we have, as Beatrice mentioned there as well, you know, publishing. The publishing world is also hectic because often, you know, it's you marginalize, so you become, it's very hegemonic. So what happens is that if you're sitting on the fringes and the margins and your knowledge does not fit what the knowledge is of what they want, and I think that's something that we also have to think about. So I just want to say to both speakers as well, it's been awesome listening to both of you, and thank you. I've learned so much as well today. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Lauren. So as we wrap up, I know we could sit here for hours. This has been such a fascinating conversation and so needed to be discussing and learning about these concepts as we are fostering critical agents within the education system. I've just seen some comments coming up in the chat, and I want to remind students that, you know, we were working through this post-humanism philosophy as well, that we mustn't fall into this trap of thinking very simplistically about technology. Technology is not the laptop and the artificial intelligence. Technology is simply another concept for tools that are used as catalysts to advanced learning tools. Pens are technology, we're technology. And then when we think about Indigenous knowledge system, I know we had a colleague on last year that spoke so beautifully about his own experience as both a learner and then becoming a teacher and then becoming a lecturer. And speaking about how, as a learner, growing up in an African country, they were forced to speak English. And he wouldn't understand some of this, and he became a science teacher. And yet it was only much later that he started to look and go, but I know fermentation. My grandmother used to do it all the time, but I know these things. We were taught about it all the time. We just never used the words fermentation or chemistry or elements or compounds, but I know this knowledge. And we need to be careful of assuming that technology is simply your laptop and your computer and your cell phone and so forth and internet. Technology could be, like Beatrice was talking about, creating beads and then using the beads to tell a story. Technology is simply using tools to advance learning. Technology has always existed in society in one shape or form and another. Learners would be going out and creating spears and arrows and using that to dissect animals and learn about anatomy. So in all cultures around the world, predating this Eurocentric knowledge of science and laboratories, this knowledge existed, and technology has always existed with education, just in different forms. So be careful of falling into this trap of now looking that traditional or indigenous knowledge is far-fetched from technology, and that technology is this futuristic, technological, artificial intelligence kind of concept. Okay, so we've come to the end of our session. A warm thanks to Dr. Molefe and Dr. Carla. It has been fascinating to have you here. And I'm sure you've been busy with the conversation to see all the wonderful comments in the chat. So we will definitely send that to you so you can have a look. So Simon, if you're still somewhere in the background, I would really appreciate saving the chat for us and saving the participant list as well. So thank you, Dr. Molefe. It was a pleasure having you here. I'll definitely give you a minute to have a few words. And thank you, yes, Dr. Carla, as well. It was an absolute honor to have you both here. Yes, Motsama, you would like to say some parting words.
So thank you. Look, there's just this thing burning in my heart. I want to share it. Look, for me, ultimately, education is about creating conditions for humans to be more human. So that's what the struggle is about. The struggle, it's all of us want to conditions so that we become more human. Whether we use technology, it should create conditions for us to be more human. And whether we're reading books, that's what Ubuntu is about. Ubuntu is about creating conditions for humanity to be more, the quality of it. So for me, that's what, if we say education is African in that sense, normatively, that's what it would prescribe for us to continuously create a space where we ask our pause and say, are we creating conditions for these young people to be more human in the area of sports, in the area of literacy, in the area of science, in the area, any other area? We want to see more humanity blossoming. And I think that's what, for me, the essence of what it means to be African.
Beautifully said. Thank you very much. I don't think we could finish it on a more beautiful note of what this session has truly been about. Dr. Akala, thank you as well. I don't know if you would like to say any parting words before we say goodbye.
No, thank you very much for a very stimulating session. I've thoroughly enjoyed. And I wish the students all the best. The conversation should continue. It never stops, because we only stop, to learn when our life has ended on this world. So keep the conversations going. And I think, there is a lot to talk about, not just in this session and even subsequent sessions that will follow. So we look forward to again engaging at some point. And thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being our esteemed guest panel members. Really enjoyed this conversation, appreciate it. And I hope that it's added value as well to you both. Thank you for your time and all the knowledge that has been shared and constructed in this space. And thank you, students, and to all the participants. I know it's been a tough few weeks. With all the load shedding, with everyone who's in KZN and Durban area, I know it's been very, very difficult for you all to keep up with the learning events, and I appreciate that you took this hour and a half to join us. And if you're watching us after the fact, you're watching the recording, then I hope that you're also gaining from this and enjoying the conversation. And we will continue this conversation in our learning events with both Lauren and myself. So we look forward to engaging a bit more. So having said that, everybody go well, stay well, keep safe, have a lovely evening, and thank you very, very much for joining us. Bye-bye.